Drawing lions is a hugely complicated task, even though their colourings and textures can look fairly simple. This reference photo by Leaf Blessings on Pastel might look great, but to draw from is actually quite difficult. Much of the lions are in soft shade, so we need to use some sneaky colour theory to prevent this drawing from becoming boring and flat, which is a really common pitfall that I see. I'm going to talk you through how I resolve these issues, show you my materials, and take a look at each part of the process, from how to choose your colours for an underpainting to layering techniques for realistic fur. The full tutorial is well over 7 hours long and was several weeks of work, but I wanted to share some of this with you guys and let you see how the process of making a complicated double portrait comes to life. So I'm basically just going to talk you through everything that comes to mind as we go through this time lapse of the lion and the cub. So here I'm showing you a variety of materials that I used. I used Faber Castell and Stabilo pastel pencils with a couple of Caran d'Ache and then the pan pastels as well. I didn't use that many colours. I will list them below in the description for you. And of course you will want a soft tool, which is made by the same people as pan pastels, but you don't have to use a soft tool. You can use makeup blenders. You can see these are foamy little like covers that you can put on your soft tools, and if you're careful with them they do last a while. An alternative to the pan pastels would be this set of brown hard pastels, which are really lovely for underpaintings, and I'll show you just now. Look, I'm working on the paper and you can tell it's the paper because it will easily bend, unlike the board. Some accessories would be my Faber Castell putty rubber. When you use a putty rubber, it's quite good practice to warm it up and get it moving, because then you can mold it into a variety of shapes, which is really, really useful for getting small areas clean again. So I wouldn't be without that. And I sharpen my pencils with a craft knife as well, which some people find a bit awkward, but I find it really good for the type of point that I enjoy using. So this is a really complex double portrait, and I'm going to talk to you quite a bit about a variety of things as we go through this, and why, although the reference photo looks really good, it's actually very difficult to work from for an artist. For this particular piece, I decided to begin by setting out my dynamic range, so from my darkest dark to my lightest light. And the main reason that I did this is because the shadows play such a huge part in this portrait. A lot of the portrait is actually in shadow and could be potentially quite boring, but also could end up with a painting that feels quite flat. So by giving myself a black and then a white, which I just very carefully glazed over with a very light lemon to warm it up a little bit, I then have my range from my dark to my light. Effectively, it's kind of giving me a measuring system, and it just helps me to see the context of all of my values as I begin to build them up, because the underpainting stage, which was what we are at the moment, is a really difficult stage to figure out sometimes. Because there isn't a lot of context down, we can't necessarily see if we're going too dark or too light, or maybe even too colourful. So for this underpainting, I start with the pan pastels and I try and be really general, which is what I always aim for with an underpainting. And then you'll see as we go through, I become more and more specific until eventually we are out of the underpainting stage and we're into the detail stage. So a lot of people ask me how I figure out the different colours that you need for an underpainting. And I do actually have a little FAQ video on this, which is on my blog, and I will endeavour to remember to link that to you below. And basically it talks about the fact that for an underpainting, you want something that disappears into the background of your subject. So you want something that is the general tone or value is the light or darkness of an area. And then you want the general colour as well. So you are being general and you're saying this whole area is this kind of brown, and then we're going to move into a different value and it's this kind of brown, which you can see is what I'm doing here. I've got these really big areas at the moment, and of course as I move on the underpainting becomes more complex and then eventually becomes the detail stage. But what you're looking for effectively is if you took your reference photo and you placed a blur filter over the top of it, that will give you a really good idea of which values, light or dark, you need to put down for an area, and how much you can generalize and say, actually, this whole area of the cheek is going to be reduced to one value. I'm going to simplify it into one value. So putting a blur filter on can really help you if you're struggling with that. I'd also say that making some nice swatches is really good, because what you don't want to do is pick an underpainting value, and value, the light or darkness of an area, is more important than the colour. And if you pick the wrong value for part of your underpainting, you might actually end up in a situation where you can't get your details to show up over the top because you've made the underpainting colour too similar to the top layer of details and nothing really shows up. So making some swatches, which is what I'm doing here in this tutorial, I mean, it's over 7 hours long, which is why I can't share it for free. It's just mental the amount of footage that I got for this. But I show you as much as I can about the process and I don't hide anything. So I'm really telling you how I'm problem solving as I go along. You know, just because I teach pastel pencils does not mean I know everything, and it doesn't mean I sit down to do a drawing and I have the whole thing figured out. I'm problem solving as I go through, which is what I love about drawing. It is just a different type of problem solving. A bit like doing a Sudoku, but this is in colours and values instead. So something I'm going to talk to you about as we go through this is how I took this reference photo and basically made it more exciting. So as I said, the reference photo has a lot of shadows on this. And while the scene itself is really endearing and a lot of people would probably look at that and think this is a really great reference photo to work from, it is actually very tricky because it can end up looking very flat. So what I have done is I've turned to colour theory to help me out alongside the values. So most of Mum's face is in shadow. Because of that, I would see a lot of beginners choose greys and browns and end up with something that feels really lifeless and probably quite flat as well. So what I've done is I've tried to adhere to the values, the light or the dark for an area, but I've then included colour theory. So you can see on the screen there is a lot of yellow and orange in the lit areas, which we can definitely see in the reference photograph. But then I've really heightened the colours in the shadows. So I'm using their complementary colours. Now, a complementary colour, spelt with an E instead of an I, is a colour that is opposite on the colour wheel and it contrasts the other colour. So it's as opposite as you can get. Black and white are as opposite as you can get on a value scale. Yellow and purple are opposites on the colour wheel. They're complementary colours and they contrast each other. So in the shadows we have some purples and blues, and then in the highlights we have some yellows and oranges, and orange is the complementary of blue. So if you want some help with this and some free help, I do have a free ebook of 8 different colour wheels that you can download, and colour wheels are really useful. They can basically just remind you of how the colours interact with each other. So there's 8 different types of colour wheels on there. We have a basic colour wheel and then various desaturated colour wheels and some complementary colour wheels as well. And they can just be incredibly useful to help you plan out your colours for a painting. So the reason that I have put complementary opposite colours in the shadows and the highlights is to increase the contrast. So if we think about the fact that white and black, they're opposite and they create contrast that gives the illusion of a 3D form. Here I'm just showing you what it looks like after the underpainting stage. I took a photo after I'd completed every stage to put in a workbook because of course the whole painting doesn't fit on the screen. But anyway, back to what I was saying. If we are using black and white to create the illusion of a 3D form because they contrast each other, we can also use colour that contrasts, so complementary colours, to create the illusion of a 3D form. Now, the contrast of colour is not as severe as the contrast of value from black to white. It means that the contrast of colour doesn't have as an important effect on the overall 3D illusion of your drawing. However, it is, of course, still a factor that we can use. And by basically adding up these different sorts of contrasts, we can increase the illusion of a 3D form. So by turning to colour, it means that I can leave huge areas of Mum's face in shadow. I don't have to make them wildly darker than they are in the photograph. And I don't have to make areas that are in sun lighter. I'm not messing around too much with the values, but by including colour, including these complementary contrasting colours, I am increasing the contrast, but just not on a value scale. I'm increasing the contrast by using different colours. It will also make your drawing feel quite a lot more interesting, to be honest, and it helps to bring the sunshine into this piece. And I don't really do backgrounds just because they don't interest me. And I do tend to find with pastels, because they are pre-mixed colours, that backgrounds have a habit of jumping forwards and not feeling quite realistic. I tend to find they feel a little bit heavy and sort of crowd around my subjects. It's just not something that I personally enjoy doing. So what I'm doing here, what I'm showing you now, is I've moved out of the underpainting stage, and of course I'm at the detail stage, and I've started in the shadows. And in the course I talk quite a bit about which area to start in. There isn't a right or wrong, but you need to understand why you have started in a certain area and what the goal is for that. So by starting in the shadows, for me, I wanted to try and bring some detail into those areas, but try to maintain the overall value. I did add too many details in the shadows, to be honest. I kind of had a good time there, but the piece didn't end up suffering for it in the end. And then it just allowed me to have a bit more fun when I got to the highlights. So I want my most concentrated details and different colours to be in the highlights. That's where we'll have the most amount of detail. So when I got there, I could see that I could really use a wide variety of colours and get a lot of details into the highlights, and that just basically was seen by the fact that I'd already put the shadows in. So I had something to balance it from, basically. As I say, I could have put fewer details in the shadows. Normally I would, but I was just having too much of a good time drawing this piece. Something that I worked on as I was drawing this specific piece is my technique for drawing fur. So usually I would put in a slightly darker underpainting than I have for this drawing all over. So even the lighter areas I would have drawn in slightly darker to give me more of a contrast when I put my light details over the top. But a technique, I mean, it's been around forever, that I haven't been using because I didn't personally like it that much, but I have now turned to, is to make your underpainting slightly lighter than I used to, so making it this very general tone that I talked about at the beginning. And instead, this gives you the opportunity to put lighter values and darker values on top. Now, this is a way that most pastel pencil artists work. It's just not how I used to work, but I've started to enjoy working in this method quite a lot more recently. So basically, I put more layers of details down. So I put my underpainting down, and then I put a layer that is probably a light mid-tone for the area down. And then I get a little bit darker, so I'll add my shadows in. And then I go back in with probably about 2 more lighter pencils working up to my lightest value, so that the shadows are properly woven in and sit backwards. So if you look at the shadow from Mum's eye tracking down to her nose, we've got a lot of dark values in there. But over the top of the dark values, there are some lighter values, there are some lighter details, and that is giving us depth and texture. So it does take quite a lot of time to build up. It's a little bit painful for me to watch this video because I managed to give myself tendinitis from drawing so much. I kind of went a bit nuts on this and didn't take breaks because I was really enjoying it, but that resulted in several weeks of not being able to draw. So word to the wise, take breaks. The colours that I use throughout this piece, you'll notice as I start to do the cub, I make sure that I weave them from the mum into the cub, so I don't randomly start picking out new colours to do the cub's fur, even if I could see them in the reference photo. And the reason for this is it's about balancing your colour palette. So I think for beginners, you can get lost in a reference photo very easily and get a little bit too concerned with what you can see in the photo versus what's happening in your drawing. So a way to get around this is to pre-plan a colour palette, and making little palettes on scraps of Pastelmat or other paper is a really, really good thing to do before you start a painting. And then you can see how you can basically minimize the amount of pencils you want to use. And much like we were doing at the underpainting stage, you simplify things. So you say, okay, I've got a range of oranges that need to go in on Mum, and then I also have a range of oranges that need to go in on Cub, but actually I could use the same pencils. I might use them in a different ratio. Maybe I'm using more of the yellowy orange ones on the Cub, whereas I might have used more of the orangey red ones on Mum. But I try and use the same variety of pencils on both of these characters. Now, of course, if we had different mammals in the same photo, that might not be possible. entirely, because I might need to use completely different colours. Maybe it's a lion and a zebra. But even so, I would find ways to try and tie them together. Perhaps it's the warmth in the shadows. If I've gone for warm shadows in Mum, so I've got a lion that has some nice red shadows, then maybe I find the opportunity to make the shadows on the zebra also warm instead of a bluey colour and make them more red. And so they start to look like they're in the same pictorial plane. They look like they're in the same picture. Again, for a beginner, you often get tied into this is one element of the drawing and this is a completely separate element of the drawing. But by doing that, you often end up with drawings that don't appear to sit together properly. They don't knit together very well. So using a smaller variety of pencils is incredibly useful, and it will just make choosing your colours a little bit simpler, basically. So what I'm doing at the moment is starting to heighten the contrast over the cub. I do take quite a bit of time doing this, and a pencil that I was just using, the tiny little pencil, which I've used again all over both of them, is really useful colour. And I don't actually have a lot of Caran d'Ache pencils, but I would endorse this one. It's the 042 Desert Rose, and it's a kind of peachy colour. To be honest, by itself, I don't like the colour. It's not something I like particularly, and I think I wouldn't have bought it, but someone gave it to me as a tester years and years ago. I've had it for ages, and I have used it quite a bit, but it goes and goes for ages, and I've actually found it to be an incredibly useful colour. So there it is again. You can see I've only got a little bit of this colour left. This was from the lovely people at Paper Story, Angie and Chris. Quick shout out to them, because they're just wonderful people. If you're in the UK and looking to buy your art supplies, do have a look at Paper Story. Not sponsored by them or anything. I just like them. They're just wonderful people. But they gave me this pencil to try as a Caran d'Ache, and you can see that it shows up really well over the top of the other layers, but it also works very well for areas where we have golden fur in the lights. So again, something that beginners often like to do for golden fur is they would turn to a really light yellow, which is often a lemon yellow, which I have been using in this piece. But the issue with that is it's quite cold feeling, and it can often feel very false, and we make something feel just kind of bright and almost like it's a highlighter, like a highlighter yellow. And we don't want that effect. That feels very, very harsh and unrealistic. So by weaving in a peachy or a pinky kind of colour, we are taking that yellow through orange and round to red a little bit. Obviously, red doesn't have white mixed in. There's the colour again. And a peachy colour has a lot of white mixed in, which means it is desaturated. It has less colour, but it ties very, very well with the yellow, because yellow, orange and red, they are harmonious colours. They're all neighbours on the colour wheel. So it's a really good way of basically taking the acid out of a light yellow and getting a warm, light golden colour. So again, do have a look at the colour wheels, they're free to download, because you can start to understand how you can harmonise your colours by seeing which colours sit next to each other, what they look like when they're desaturated. I've also got a colour wheel that shows what happens when you mix complementary colours. You get a variety of chromatic greys. So I could go on about this for ages because I find it really interesting, but it definitely helps when you come to a reference photo such as this one, where actually from the outlook, it looks great, but when you come to draw it, it's actually very, very difficult, because, as I said, you can end up with a variety of flat-looking greys and browns for nearly all of this drawing, whereas what you've seen me build up is a very colourful and complicated underpainting over which I put pencils that weave from Mum all the way through to Cub, so it ties everything together. And the colours that I put on top, you can see I'm using a grey here. They will desaturate the brightness, the saturation of the underpainting, and make it feel more realistic. Now, by the end, this is still got quite a lot of colours in, because personally I like having these extra colours. If you've ever seen me draw a horse, you'll know what I'm talking about. But I do say throughout the course there are opportunities to swap a really bright colour for a chromatic grey, a colourful grey instead. Working on areas like this bit under the chin, this is something I'd love to talk about. So if you're a beginner especially, or maybe actually an intermediate artist and you're looking to progress your work, this area, if we look in the photograph, you can see that it's a light sandy grey colour. Now, because of that, a lot of people would actually make it too light in value. They go too close to white, whereas actually the value of that whole area around the throat is actually very dark. So I used a mid-grey over a dark underpainting, and I mixed it with a mid-brown as well. It's like a mid-tone brown. It's not super dark, but it's not light at all. And you'll see by the end of this that whole area of the neck and the under the chin that we can see sits there perfectly, but we haven't used any light greys in there, but we can still read it as this light sort of sandy grey first. That is just paying attention to your values, thinking more about what you're seeing than what you know. Labeling something as a light grey fur isn't very useful because it depends upon the context and the lighting as to whether it's going to show up as light grey. If we were to put that under a red light, it's not going to show up as light grey. It would look kind of orangey red instead. So you really need to read your reference photo, not make assumptions about what you're seeing. And that again comes back to your underpainting. So your underpainting is all about these big shapes. It's all about laying out the most important areas of light and dark. And I'd encourage you to take photos of your underpainting before you move on, because it will allow you, as you work with the details, to see whether you have accidentally disrupted the big shapes too much and potentially added too many details, which will ultimately flatten your work. It won't make it look better, because by adding too many details, you get rid of the large areas of shadows and highlights, and everything ends up becoming mid-tone. It's really odd. And again, I see it on a lot of kind of intermediate level artists' work, because they've become very good at doing their details and they have a fairly good understanding of some areas of art theory, but then they get a bit too excited and basically add too much. So at the end of any drawing, what I do is I return to the big picture again, stand back, have a nice break, and then see where I can heighten the contrast. So the contrast is what's giving us the illusion of a 3D form. So in this instance, I saw the opportunity to deepen some of the shadows. I went in with a lovely dark brown, the 177 from Faber Castell, which is a favourite of mine. It's very warm. And then I also saw the opportunity to increase the saturation a little bit in some areas of light. So as we're getting from shadow into the lighter values, that's where I've really punched up the saturation with some hot oranges in there. So just as the form is turning from shadow to lighter areas. I was also speaking throughout this that I wanted to make some of the mane brighter with some ivory and white, but I held off until the end to do this. Firstly, because as I say throughout this course, you're going to be quite careful when you're making assumptions that there's a mistake or that there's something that you can add, especially white, because before you know it, you can add too much white all over and it loses its impact. So I wait till the end to make these adjustments, and it also allows the white to stay cleaner. Right at the end is when I add on these final details, the edge details, so that they don't get smudged. Return to the blacks around the eye just to freshen them up, because they will have picked up a bit of dust and they won't actually be black anymore. And then, of course, the final thing to add on would be your whiskers. And once all of this has been done, you're ready to sign it. And to keep your work safe before framing, you should cover it with some crystal paper. And if you're not quite sure what that is, then again, there'll be a link below to a blog post about it. I really hope you've enjoyed me watching bring these lines to life. As I say, the actual course is like over 7 hours long. It's absolutely crazy, but this should give you a bit of an insight into how such a large piece of work can be brought together. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to see my next video.